You know, I've been thinking a lot about this today, and some people might say that it's not even my place to even consider it because I'm a man. But, this isn't coming from a place of condescension or, anger. It's just trying to understand what's going on. Because when I look back at history, real history, there was a time in this country where women had nothing. No vote, no real voice, limited rights in their own home. And it led to, brave women like Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes actually standing up to try and make a change. They were brave enough not to sit quietly, they didn't ask politely, they ended up in jail, they ended up in a lot of trouble, but they fought. And they fought for something simple, something fair and something undeniable. And that was equality under the law. And every woman listening to this today has them to thank for the freedoms that they now enjoy. But when you look back at that movement, you can fully understand what they were, so angry about and so driven to try and change. And you've got to respect it because it had a clear goal, a clear purpose and a very clear moral foundation. Clearly, to me, somewhere along the line, something changed. And, I'm asking about this, talking about this, not in an accusatory way. I'm just honestly asking because today, when people talk about feminism, it doesn't feel as clear anymore. It feels more fragmented. And it's like it's trying to be everything to everyone, but then it loses its focus. It's a bit like the jack of all trades, master of none. And, when I look around today at today's society, I try and understand what this movement actually protects anymore. Because if it's about women's rights, it doesn't seem to be achieving that. Or has it actually morphed into something more broader, more ideological, something more harder to define? And this might get uncomfortable, but I think it's a fair question. Why is it that some issues are shouted from the rooftops while others are, literally spoken about in whispers or behind closed doors, or maybe not even spoken about at all? Let's take the national conversation about grooming gangs. A horrific failure to women and girls in this country, that affected vulnerable girls in every community with a huge systemic breakdown, which, clearly we can accept involved the police, the social services, the local authorities, and the perpetrators. Previously this would have been something that had shaken the country to its core. And yet now it just feels like a conversation that people really don't want to talk about. That they're choosing their words even, before they open their mouths. Why aren't more women angry about this? Or if they are, can you point me in the direction of them? Because it seems like the general consensus in the mainstream media is silent. But then if we contrast that with the murder of Sarah Everard, and that quite rightly sparked a national outrage. There was candlelit vigils, there was wall-to-wall media coverage and a huge cultural moment around women's safety. Now, I'm not saying that one is more important than the other because both were horrific, and that's not actually the point. Both of these issues demanded, significant amount of attention, but why is it that the response feels so different? Why did one of these events become a national defining moment, while the other one feels far more difficult to even talk about? Is it about the scale? Is it about narrative? Or is it what fits more comfortably within the conversations that people are willing to have? And I'm not claiming that I have the answers here. I'm genuinely just asking because it's intrigued me because I don't understand it. If a movement is built on protecting women, then surely that protection has to be consistent to all women, not selective, not dependent on politics or culture or who might be offended. And then there's another question that I can't quite shake as well. When we talk about freedom, women's freedom, what's actually meant by that? Because, when we hear about, it's a woman's choice, that may be the case, and sometimes it is. But what about when it isn't? What about when the choice that the woman is expressing is actually shaped by peer pressure, family pressure, expectation, by a fear of what will happen to them, ending up in a suitcase, if they step out of line? How are we supposed to tell a difference? And more importantly, are we even allowed to talk about this anymore? You know, I don't really understand this real movement of empowerment, real freedom. You know, surely that means that women should be able to question everything. You know, even the things that make us uncomfortable, even the things that we're told or they're told are off limits. And I'll keep coming back to this because, you know, if those early feminists like Pankhurst, you know, these women that risked everything, if they were here today, would they recognise the feminist movement at all? Would they feel proud of it? You know, would they be happy with what it's become? Or would they be asking the same questions that I am? You know, has feminism lost its way? Or has it evolved into something that we don't quite understand yet? I'm not sure, but I definitely think it's a conversation worth having. And, you know, not with anger, not with anger towards me because I'm raising a question that I shouldn't be entitled to. But I think it's important because there's many young girls that are going to be growing up in this world and, you know, they deserve to be defended as well, don't they?